You're listening to New Churches Podcast, a production of Send Network on newchurches.com. We discuss all things church planting. If you're looking to take your next step toward multiplication, you're in the right place. Newchurches.com provides relevant and reliable resources for church planters, church multipliers, and disciple makers. Our growing library features pastors, planters, and church leaders like Ed Stetzer, David Platt, Trillia Newbell, Christine Hoover, Dahadi Lewis, Trevin Wax, and many others.
Hey, welcome back to another episode of the New Churches Podcast. My name is Noah Oldham, back in the studio with Vance Pitman. Good to see you, Vance.
Man, it is great to be here today. This is an exciting week in the life of my family. This week, in a couple of days, my wife and I will celebrate 32 years of marriage. And so in light of us talking today about things that affect women and discipleship, I just thought I had to mention the backbone of my marriage, my family, and the ministry of 32 years. My wife today, Christy, and celebrating 32 years. So yeah, great day to be on a podcast. Got some exciting celebration to do later on this week.
Yeah, man, I love it. Hey, on this episode today, we are going to be taking on another side of a topic we recently tackled together at Vance. Recently, we talked about small groups in the new church context, specifically the importance of small groups for men. Well, today we're taking on the other side of that conversation as we discuss small groups for women. And our returning guest today is the one, the only, Aunt Jen Wilkin.
Yes.
Welcome. You have to listen to an earlier podcast to understand that. But Jen, by way of reminder, is an author and Bible teacher from Dallas, Texas. She has organized and led studies for women in home, church, and parachurch context. She's an advocate for Bible literacy. Her passion is to see others become articulate and committed followers of Christ with a clear understanding of why they believe what they believe, grounded in the Word of God. It's so great to have you back, Jen.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, Jim, we appreciate you taking the time. And obviously with the New Churches podcast, a lot of our listening audience are involved in the starting and launching of new churches. Mm-hmm. And most new churches either start with or even as small groups. So what would you say are the major reasons to have groups for both men and women, gender-specific small groups?
Oh, yeah. Well, gender-specific small groups are one of my favorite things because I've spent most of my time, my ministry time, in as we affectionately call it, the estrogen pond, the all pink spaces. And so those spaces have abilities that mixed gender spaces don't. And I always like to be clear. You may have covered this when you talked about men's small groups. This is a both and. We don't want to have only all male spaces and all female spaces, and we don't want to have only mixed spaces. But that all female space matters so much because it's the first place a lot of times that a sensitive disclosure will happen. If there is something going on in a marriage that's more than just typical marriage difficulty, abuse is usually disclosed first in an all female space. Not only that, but you can be more vulnerable about sin patterns that might be more unique to a female space than they might be to a mixed gender space. And then I would argue, too, that in terms of learning outcomes, which is one of my favorite topics, you can achieve certain learning outcomes in an all-female space that you might not be able to in a mixed gender space. Often women are hesitant to enter in at a thought level in a mixed gender space. They will enter in at a feelings level. And I don't want to overgeneralize differences between men and women, but I think it's generally observable that often women bring their feelings to church with more natural instinct than they might their thoughts. They sometimes think they're supposed to take their thinking off when they walk into the church because church is where we feel. So in a single gender female space, we can press women on something that might be less intuitive for them when they gather, and that is having a thought level discussion. Whereas in men's groups, my assumption would be that in your conversation there, sort of the opposite comes out, right? We have to press men on feelings level discussion. Women can do that in their sleep. So, yeah.
That's really good. You said something there that I want you to kind of double click on a little bit, that you like to emphasize learning outcomes. Unpack that a little bit for us in a group dynamic.
Well, so in a church planning scenario, my assumption would be that the small group is your only vehicle for discipleship. Would you
Yeah.
say that's accurate?
I
Which
would
is
say primary for sure.
Yeah, primary for sure. And so I think it's important to recognize the strengths and weaknesses of a small group and being able to form disciples. Um, in my experience, I've been a small group leader with my husband for 5 years at my most recent church, and for years before that at another church. Um, a small group is really good for a feelings level, application driven discussion. It is tough for a thought level learning outcome discussion. But, when we talk about theological illiteracy and biblical illiteracy in the church, if all we're having are feelings level or application driven discussions, then we are probably not being discipled into the basic Christian beliefs that are our inheritance. And so it's important to think, when we gather, what are we using that time for? Many times, the way that a small group setting is used is because the leader asks, well, what do the people want to do? Right. And I would argue that is the wrong first question. The right first question is, how are disciples formed? And then how do we get them there? And typically, as we discussed in our earlier episode, women have not had as much exposure to literacy building spaces as men might have, because men more intuitively gravitate toward a thought level conversation. So in a single gender space, you can invite women into the life of the mind as it relates to their faith. And then you want to think about, what are the tools that I'm going to use to move them down the path? So if all they're doing is getting together and sharing their story, or what they think what this verse means to me, or they're we're having cherry picked little moments that they're going to sit and do, then that's not a discipleship pathway. That's a friend group where you're getting to know each other and be vulnerable, and that's great, but it's not a discipleship pathway. They're not going to understand the doctrine of the Trinity at the other end of doing that, and that matters.
Yeah. So
good.
Jen, what would you say to the new church planter who's out there trying to form all of this? He's trying to build. He's just now heard, maybe for the first time in a long time, it's about the outcome. It's not, what does this verse mean, but how are disciples made? That's the first question to ask. What would you say for creating a structure for small groups that include both of those rhythms, or both of those spaces that allow for the feeling and the thinking to happen when you don't have a million ministry options?
Well, I think that a lot of times we think that the secret sauce to those spaces is really good content. And I think really good content matters. I'm a person who tries to create really good content. But what is really important, particularly for women in terms of being able to opt in and invest in a small group space, is that there be a structure to what's happening. So the more organic it is, the more it penalizes female involvement. Because women have to plan not just for themselves, but often for other people for whom they're primary caregivers, whether that's an aging parent or whether it's children. And so
you can say it, their husband too. You can say it.
So let's look at the mixed gender small group for just a second, because it has implications for the single gender as well. In a mixed gender small group, what typically happens is a man is in charge of the group, and so his responsibility is print off some discussion questions and show up and lead the discussion. The female responsibility is get all the hospitality elements set and make sure that the kids are taken care of, which means whatever conversation is happening during the small group, if something goes haywire with one of those two things, she has to leave the conversation and come back. She's not having a normative experience of the group the way that the men might be. She's not gaining from the discussion the way that the men might be. Not only that, but if you're concerned about raising up female leaders in your church plant, the mixed gender small group actually sort of presses against that. There are limited leadership possibilities for women in a mixed gender group typically. And so if you have single gender groups, there's more likelihood that a woman can exercise a leadership gifting with more immediacy. So those are some aspects of what can be challenging. But then also, typically, a small group setting sort of bounces around on the calendar. Like, well, we met on Tuesday nights for a while, but now we're going to move it to Thursday nights. And for women who are planning for many people's schedules, this is a barrier to entry. Not only that, but the childcare thing itself is a barrier to entry. It's just, if there's not a way to provide care for children that she doesn't have to plan for, she will always be playing catch up with that in addition to being a participant in the group. So if you're able to offer single gender spaces and have a solution for childcare that she doesn't have to organize, that's huge. And do I know that that's expensive and difficult? I do, because I've worked in a local church for many, many years. We all spend money on lots of things. We're all making decisions on how to spend money. I cannot say this loudly enough. Spend the money. Have a sound system that isn't as effective. Spend the money on this. Have a screen for your worship lyrics that isn't as high resolution. Spend the money on this. Also, obviously, call others in the church to help provide this in a church plant setting.
That's so good.
So
we learned that we learned early on in our church plant journey the same thing you're saying. As we had mixed gender for a long time, gospel communities, the whole family together. It was this really beautiful picture in our mind of being Acts 2. And then we found out the struggle that you're talking about is anytime a kid cried or there's something, it was the women that were leaving, the moms that were leaving. And we said, we have to create a structure that makes discipleship for women not only accessible, but actual. We can say it's accessible, they have a choice, but we want to make sure it's actually happening. And that moved us to all of our small groups, almost all of them, besides those who were empty nesters who said, this season of life, we want to do this. We made them single gendered. And then we had to create these middle spaces that were mixed gendered for theological training, because my wife in particular would just say, Noah, it's not even worth it. And we had to create that. And that's so helpful, Jen.
So Jen, then talking on the well, go ahead. I'll let you comment to that. Go ahead.
Say, in the mixed gender space, they tend to sort of major in this idea of we need to connect around our emotions. And when, again, that's pushing men on the thing that's hard for them, and it's giving women a pass because that's easy. And you've seen this because in a mixed small group, when you divide up for prayer, the men are done in like 30 seconds, and the women take 10 minutes, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
And that's why. And so we don't want to have our primary vehicle for discipleship be something that only presses men on the thing they need to grow in and isn't pressing women on the thing that they need to grow in as well.
That's so good.
So let's talk about the flip side of this for a moment. Are there any weaknesses to gender-specific groups being the only expression of groups in the life of a church plant? What would be the drawbacks to there never being gender-mixed groups in the context of a plant?
Man, the mixed gender space is so important because I would think that what we've lost sight of in the church today often is the idea, which we discussed in our earlier episode, of the church as the family of God. Imagine if in your nuclear family, dad and the sons always hung out together and mom and the daughters always hung out together, but they never had any shared spaces. We would have alarm bells going off if that family was in our church, right? And so when we think about the church as the family of God, we need places where men and women interact as brothers and sisters. That's that New Testament word that we see in the one another's, adelphoi. It means brothers and sisters.
Yes.
And what we have been absorbing is a cultural value, which says men and women cannot have brother-sisterly relationships, that they can only have sexual or romantic relationships. And so it's dangerous for men and women to be in the same space, because if they actually genuinely like each other, well, we all know where that's going to go. That's actually from When Harry Met Sally. That's not from the Bible. Harry says men and women can't be friends. The sex always gets in the way. And the church has said, yeah, that's true. We actually think that's true. But Jesus wasn't that fastidious in his relationships, right? He had places where he interacted with both men and women. He had Mary sitting at his feet to receive his teaching. And so I think when we think about shared spaces, that's what we're saying is just as in a healthy nuclear family, the whole family is interacting. Brothers look at sisters and go, I love you and I value you as a person. Sisters look at brothers and say the same thing. And so, one of the ways that we can tell that this isn't happening is if when you are together in mixed spaces, the men are always going to one side and the women are always going to the other side. And if you gave the men a pop quiz, like, hey, Jim, what do you know about Jane? And he's like, she's great. She's married to Stephen. Nope. That means Jim doesn't actually know Jane. Do you know what Jane likes to do for her hobbies? Do you know where Jane went to school? Just these basic questions that help us to build trust with one another and celebrate one another. The culture has lost its concept of friendship. And that's not just between men and women, but between people. Any strong emotion for another human being is viewed as sexual or romantic. And so where should we reclaim the beauty of brother-sisterly friendships? I would argue that
Jen,
if the church doesn't do it, it's not going to happen.
1,000,000%. And I can already hear Twitter sphere beginning to want to attack. So I want to give you an opportunity. What you're not saying don't be wise. You're not saying don't have boundaries. You're not saying, but you are saying Jesus makes a difference in how we relate to both men and women. And he's created a family where we can learn from one another and grow from one another and be challenged and encouraged by one another. So unpack that a little bit more.
Yeah. Well, basically, I mean, again, think about your human family, but also like Vance, if I came to Atlanta, you and I are not going to go have dinner together in a restaurant, just the two of us. That would be stupid because it's even though you might see me as a sister and I see you as a brother. It's just not worth the cost, right? It's not worth the perception cost. But I do find that is most often what people are afraid of. They're not afraid that they will have an affair. They're afraid people will think they want to have an affair. And that's very different. And so we do have to manage perceptions. We don't just operate in a vacuum, but we also celebrate when there are places where it's easier than other places to have normal human interactions with both people of the same sex and people of the other sex. And so that place in a church plant is someone's living room where men and women are there together and we're all having good conversation. And then you can also, when you make the topic of conversation, building theological literacy or building Bible literacy, well, there again, you've taken out a lot of it's like everybody can talk about the Bible together. That's not a risky conversation. Everybody can talk about how we're learning about a doctrine or something like that. And we grow in our respect for one another as people are sharing how their thinking is developing. So this is, I don't think again, I think we can lack creative imagination around the completely innocent ways in which these interactions can happen to where we humanize each other. Because when we don't know each other, we have a tendency to objectify each other, to treat each other as categories instead of as people.
Yeah.
So good. So good.
Hey, another topic, often another aspect of groups and the specific emphasis on women's ministry in a church is the focus. It's women's ministry on its own as a branch of the church's discipleship. Why are small groups an important aspect of women's ministry? And how have you seen them positively impact women's spiritual growth and their community among the women in the church?
Well, one of the nice things about them is they offer a really good front door to church membership. Women are very organically able to invite other women to come into these spaces, and it's an introduction to the ethos of the church through that space. We never want women's ministry to be disconnected from the overall mission of the church. And so the woman who is serving in that space as a leader is constantly going to be interacting with the pastor who is setting the direction for the church. Now, if the pastor has the attitude of, I'm just going to let her keep the women happy, and then she has to functionally operate in a vacuum. So we don't want that. We want there to be good back and forth between them where there's an alignment of goals and an alignment of, hey, this is what this space is for. In other words, women's ministry is part of an adult discipleship strategy. It is not a
Yes.
place where women just gather and do what women do. It is not beneath the regard of the senior pastor. It is not an incomprehensible space to him. It is a space that he consciously invests in.
That's great.
A lot of times women's ministry can get the narrative of, well, I don't know, we don't want a church within a church. Like, I have heard this now for 25 years. And what I never hear is that said about the college ministry that's run by someone with the title of pastor. I never hear that said about the student ministry, which often is run by someone with the title of pastor. And so I want us to be careful that we don't see women's ministry as a specific category of space that is more prone to take on a church within a church feel. Not only that, but I think when that is said, we misunderstand what the church is. Like, what my experience of women's ministry is, it's not replicating what happens in the gathering. It's doing something very specific and important. But again, the closer the connection between the pastor and that woman leader, the more alignment there's going to be.
It feels like you're speaking to intentionality, that if somebody says it's going to become a church within a church, it's because there's not an intentionality to say this is a part of that adult discipleship plan and process for our church. So the intentionality of saying, how can we best make disciples? One of those tools may be a women's ministry element, but it fits within the whole if you're intentional. That's so good.
And we include her in our meetings. It's not like the women that I'll talk to who will say they pegged my ministry as this ivory tower ministry, but I couldn't get a meeting with the guy in charge. It's like, well, and then the second that something is not what he thought it was going to be, he's like, you know what? They went rogue. Let's kill it. It's like, no, were you invested in what they were doing? So,
Well, and not only that, when you talk about student ministry and college ministry, which I've always been a part of those things, led those things personally, had those in our churches, but you'd be hard pressed to go to chapter and verse in the Bible and say, we need to start a student ministry or college ministry. Yet you can go to a place in the Bible that says, older men teach younger men, older women teach younger women. Like, it's in the Word of God. Like, this is, if there is a biblical paradigm for ministry, it includes women ministering to women and raising up disciples for the purpose of the mission. So good. So I want to get real practical for a minute, Jen, for our pastors, church planters, ministry leaders that are listening. What do you believe are some key ingredients for a successful small group experience for women in a church setting? If you were going to say, here are 3, 4, 5 ingredients so that our planters, those listening to this that are establishing new churches, they can very practically measure, are we including these ingredients in our small group setting? What are those for a women's small group?
Okay. So it depends on what your goal is with the small group. And so remember, I've said that I think that the most important thing we can give to women in all female small groups is learning, that they come with a thought level goal. So that means you have to really train those female leaders in how to invite women into a thought level discussion. It means they're going to ask questions like, what do you think? And they're going to look for a thought level response, and they're going to lead by example in that. So there's a lot of training that happens with small group leaders around this group is this, not that. Because women expect that it will be a feelings level, application driven space. So if you're going to reorient it to something else, you tell your leaders, this is what it is. You tell your participants, this is what it is. And then once a small group has met for, let's say, a fall and a spring, you're going to circle back around and say, hey, did we do that? Was that our accomplishment? You need feedback loops on whether that's happening or not. Small group leaders need to know how to handle basic group dynamics. How do you invite in the woman who is quieter than the other women? What do you do when a woman says something that's just straight wrong? How do you invite women in to be able to say, I don't know, but I think it might mean this? That's a really hard skill. Women think they're supposed to guess the right answer or guess what they should say instead of, no, this is actually where my thinking is right now. And the reason that they are this way is because these are the kinds of resources we have given them. It's a I don't even want to call it a benign neglect. I think it's an infantilization of women in the way that we have resourced them. So that brings us to another aspect. You want to be looking for good curriculum that is written at a thought level for women. It's not only at a thought level. At some point, we do move to the feelings level. We want it to move from head to heart. We want it to move from heart to actions. And so look for the kinds of curriculum that are going to help women observe, interpret, and apply. And then also be sure that your meeting time is at a time that women are able to attend with the least number of barriers to them being there. Because when you do have them there, you're going to lower the bar on how they join the group, and then you're going to raise the bar on what they're doing while they're in it.
Love
And
that.
we inhabit an age of low expectations for Christian discipleship. We have, for about the past 40 years, said they'll only give us X amount of time. We have to continually lower the bar to get them to come. There's a church in my community that is not doing that. They have raised the bar. In fact, they even do it in their student ministry. By the time students graduate from high school, they've gotten systematic theology, Old Testament, and New Testament. That church is the Mormon church.
Oh.
Why are the Mormons more committed to raising the bar on discipleship than we are?
Ooh.
And the people in our church will do hard things. They're running marathons, they're doing Whole30, but we're like, you know what? We're going to give you this tiny little thing that's not going to require anything of you, and we're constantly apologizing for what we're offering. And what you do is you message a value for what you're doing. So I think there's a whole cultural element to this. As you think about what do we want these small groups to accomplish, it's going to be, hey, we're going to make it as easy as possible for you to say yes, and then we're going to ask something of you, because people value things that ask something of them, and women do too. And so I went through that whole rant for the purpose of circling back and saying, don't think that only men want to be challenged in their theological or biblical literacy. Women are hungry for this, and they come alive with it.
So good.
Jen, this is the last question, and this may be a plug here for you, an opportunity. So if someone's looking for materials, all the things you just said, especially about materials, what are some of the materials they should start with?
Actually, on my Instagram account, I have linked to some Bible study resources that are not just mine. Obviously, I'm thinking in these terms when I write things, but I'm not the only person who is. And so you can go to my highlights, and there are some highlights there that will point you toward resources. And I think this conversation comes up for men as well. A lot of the things that are being written out there, for whatever reason, there are more of these curricula that are written for a female space, but in most cases, they're not super gender specific. So in a men's group, if you can get over the cover or the title, there's probably some useful things there for you as well. And I wrote a book called Women of the Word that's just about basic Bible study method. And so, I'll get guys sending me pictures where they've put a piece of tape over the woe and it says Men of the Word on the cover or whatever.
I love it.
Because again, theological education is not gendered. Biblical literacy is not gendered. It doesn't mean that there aren't nuances to it. But as you think about how you're going to equip women, remember, women are people. And so we equip them with just these same things that we would use in a male small group, but we open up other possibilities for the discussion when it's all female.
And Jen, we'll make sure we put a link in the show notes to that very list so that people can go check that out. And just a real honor to have you on the podcast. Thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks for having the conversation.
Yeah, and thank you to everybody listening to this episode of the New Churches podcast. Until next time, may the word of Christ dwell in you richly, and may you teach and admonish one another in all wisdom, even in your small groups. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the New Churches podcast, brought to you by Send Network. If you like what you heard, take a few minutes to rate and review us or share this episode with a friend. It's the best way to show your support. To find more reliable resources to start your new church well, visit newchurches.com.